It was a warm afternoon in the small town of Hanover, South Carolina. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the quiet streets. People were still wrapped in the rhythm of their everyday lives, the steady pulse of routine keeping them grounded. But for Samuel Hayes, today was about to take a turn that would shake the very foundation of the community. Samuel, a 68-year-old veteran of the Vietnam War, had long since put away the physical scars of battle. His hair had grayed, his steps slowed, but his presence remained strong. He was a man of quiet dignity, a respected figure in Hanover who had spent his years after service working as a mechanic and volunteering at the local Veterans Hall. He'd built a life here, a life that had seen its fair share of hardship, but also a life filled with peace, until today. As Samuel made his way through the town square, his eyes fell on something that didn't belong. A small crowd had gathered near the park's central bench, where a confrontation seemed to be escalating. A young man, likely in his early 20s, stood cornered, trembling, as a police officer towered over him. The officer's name was David McAllister, a man known around town for his aggressive tactics. He had been on the force for nearly a decade, and many had heard rumors of his intolerance toward anyone who didn't share his background or worldview. Samuel squinted, his curiosity piqued. He could tell by the young man's posture that he was afraid. His hands were visibly shaking as he fumbled with something in his pockets. The officer's harsh voice rang out, but Samuel couldn't make out the words from across the square. The crowd around them was equally tense, unsure whether to intervene or stand by in silence. Samuel felt the familiar pull of his military training, the instinct to step in when things were about to spiral out of control. He took a deep breath and began walking toward the gathering. His hand instinctively adjusted the collar of his shirt as if preparing for something that wasn't yet visible but felt inevitable. As Samuel approached, he called out in a calm, steady voice, "Everything all right here, Officer McAllister?" The officer snapped his head toward Samuel, his face darkening with irritation. "This ain't your business, Hayes," McAllister growled, his posture stiffening. "Keep walking." Samuel didn't flinch. He knew the officer's reputation, but he also knew when a situation was about to escalate unnecessarily. The young man in front of McAllister seemed more frightened by the officer's presence than anything else. Samuel's voice remained steady as he turned toward the young man. "You all right, son?" he asked gently. The young man nodded, but his body language screamed fear. Samuel turned his gaze back to Officer McAllister. The crowd had grown, but no one dared to intervene. The tension in the air was palpable, and Samuel could feel the unmistakable sense of dread creeping up on him. He knew what was coming next. "Let the kid go, McAllister," Samuel said, his voice still calm but firm. "He hasn't done anything wrong. Just let him go." McAllister's face flushed with anger. His fists clenched as he took a step toward Samuel. "You think I need your permission to do my job?" he sneered. Samuel didn't back down. "There's no need for violence here," he said, his voice low but clear, trying to hold McAllister's gaze. "This doesn't have to end badly. Just let the boy go." For a moment, there was a stillness, a quiet before the storm. The officer stood there, his eyes narrowing, his body tense. Samuel had seen it before, the way someone like McAllister would refuse to relinquish control. The way authority could twist itself into something ugly when it wasn't challenged. And just like that, the officer lashed out. Before Samuel could react, McAllister shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. The crowd gasped. Samuel's body, though aged, was still strong, and he caught himself before falling. But the shove had been enough to knock him off balance, and he could feel the familiar ache in his joints as he regained his footing. The officer wasn't finished. McAllister's face contorted with rage, and in one swift motion, he swung his fist at Samuel. The blow hit Samuel squarely in the face, sending him crashing to the ground. The sound of his skull hitting the pavement rang in his ears as the world around him went momentarily dark. Blood began to pool under his head, and for a few terrifying moments, it seemed like everything might just stop. The crowd stood frozen in shock, some too terrified to act, others fumbling for their phones to record the scene. McAllister, now standing over Samuel, took a step back, his breath heavy, his mind raced, scrambling to find a way out of the mess he had just created. The young man, still shaken, stood off to the side, his eyes wide in horror. The officer's attempt to cover up the situation began almost immediately. He grabbed his radio, his voice shaking as he called for backup, trying to twist the narrative in his favor. But what Officer McAllister didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Samuel Hayes had a son who held a position of power in the state and was now about to be pulled into a story of corruption, brutality, and a fight for justice that would shake Hanover to its core. Michael Hayes had always been the embodiment of control. As the state attorney general, he was used to being in the public eye, making tough decisions, and handling sensitive matters. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the call that shattered his composure. It was late afternoon when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Michael had been at his desk, reviewing case files, when the voice on the other end sent his heart into a rapid, erratic rhythm. "Mr. Hayes, it's about your father," the woman on the line said, her voice shaky with a quiet panic. "There's been an incident. Your father, he's been hurt badly. You need to come to the hospital. He's in a coma." Michael's world seemed to stop. His father, Samuel Hayes, the man who had always been his pillar of strength, had always been a quiet figure of dignity and respect in their small town. The thought of something happening to him, especially at the hands of a police officer, was unimaginable. What happened? Michael's voice was controlled, but his stomach churned with a mixture of disbelief and dread. There was a confrontation in the park. A police officer, Officer David McAllister, was involved. "Your father tried to intervene. He's in critical condition right now." Michael stood there, motionless for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. His father, a man who had served his country and given so much to his community, was now lying unconscious in a hospital bed because of a police officer's brutal actions. Is he going to be okay?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. The nurse's silence spoke volumes. "We're doing everything we can. You should get here as soon as possible." Without another word, Michael grabbed his jacket and stormed out of his office. He moved through the corridors of his office building as if on autopilot, his mind racing with thoughts of vengeance, justice, and the looming shadow of the corrupt system he had spent his career trying to dismantle. The hospital was a flurry of activity when Michael arrived. The sterile, white walls seemed to close in on him as he walked through the hallways, the beeping of machines and hushed conversations creating an atmosphere of somber urgency. He had never felt this powerless in his life. The doctors had stabilized his father, but the prognosis was grim. They could do nothing but wait and hope for signs of improvement. When Michael finally reached his father's room, he found Samuel lying still, hooked up to an array of machines. His strong, weathered face was pale, his breathing shallow. The man who had been a war hero, a symbol of strength and resilience, now seemed fragile and defeated. The nurse left him alone with his father, and Michael took a seat beside the bed, the full weight of the situation sinking in. His mind flashed back to his childhood, to the lessons his father had taught him. Samuel Hayes had always been a man of integrity, someone who believed in justice above all else, the same justice that was now cruelly out of reach. Michael's thoughts turned to Officer McAllister. He had no doubt that the man's actions had been deliberate. McAllister had always been known for his quick temper, his tendency to escalate situations rather than diffuse them. But this wasn't just a case of a bad cop losing his cool. No, this was something deeper. It was a reflection of a broken system, one that allowed men like McAllister to operate with impunity, to treat people, especially black men like his father, as expendable. And now, Michael knew he had to act. He wasn't just fighting for his father's life, he was fighting for the very soul of the community that had allowed this to happen. The system was broken, and it was his job to fix it. As he sat there, the quiet hum of the machines filling the room. Michael made a promise to himself, and to his father. He would not let this slide. He would not rest until those responsible faced justice. Back in Hanover, the news spread like wildfire. Samuel Hayes, a man known and loved in their small town, had been brutally attacked by a police officer in broad daylight. The community was in shock. People gathered in the town square. Whispers of police brutality now filling the air. The story began to unfold. And as the video footage of the assault spread across social media, the public outcry grew louder. Protests erupted in the streets, with residents demanding answers. For years, they had heard rumors of McAllister's violent tendencies. But this was different. This wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a reality that had shattered their trust in law enforcement. And among those demanding justice was Michael Hayes. He immediately began to mobilize his office, reaching out to investigators, reviewing the footage, and preparing for the long legal battle ahead. The public was watching, and Michael knew that this was his moment to make a real difference. To expose the corruption that had festered in the department for years. But Michael didn't just want justice for his father. He wanted to dismantle the system that had allowed Officer McAllister and others like him to operate without consequences. For years, the department had swept complaints under the rug, ignored accusations of excessive force, and protected its officers, no matter the cost. This culture of corruption needed to end. As the days passed, the protests continued to grow. People who had once trusted the police force were now calling for reform. Michael knew that he had to be the one to lead this charge. His father's fight for justice had now become his own. The war for accountability was on. Michael spent sleepless nights combing through evidence, reviewing the footage, and preparing the case. The road ahead was long, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not stop until justice was served. The next morning, Michael received a call that would change everything. "Mr. Hayes," the voice on the other end of the line began. "We've got more on Officer McAllister. The investigation into his past misconduct is far worse than we thought. We're talking about years of complaints, racial profiling, excessive force, and it's all been covered up." Michael felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was worse than he had imagined. But it also meant that the fight for justice was just beginning. The deeper he dug, the more corruption he uncovered. McAllister wasn't just a rogue officer, he was a product of a broken system. And that system needed to be exposed for what it was. Michael hung up the phone, his resolve hardening. The weight of the case was heavy, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The fight for his father's justice would become the catalyst for much-needed change in the system. There would be no turning back. The following days were a blur of legal meetings, protests, and constant media attention. Hanover was no longer just a small town in South Carolina. It had become ground zero for a movement. The incident involving Samuel Hayes had ignited something in the community, something that couldn't be put out. And Michael Hayes was right in the center of it all. Everywhere he went, people were asking questions, demanding answers. The video of his father's brutal assault had gone viral, and it seemed like the entire country was watching. Social media buzzed with outrage. News outlets reported on the protests and the call for police reform. The system that had long protected Officer David McAllister was now under intense scrutiny. And it was only a matter of time before the full weight of the law came down on him. Michael knew the importance of keeping his composure, but inside, the rage was building. Every time he saw the footage of his father, lying unconscious in that park, his anger grew. The footage, the raw brutality of it, was undeniable, and it had fueled the public's demand for justice. But Michael knew that while public outcry was important, the legal battle was what would truly bring about change. The first step in that battle was to investigate Officer McAllister thoroughly. Michael's team had been working tirelessly, digging into McAllister's history, reviewing complaints against him, and uncovering evidence that would eventually be used in court. It wasn't just McAllister they were going after, it was the entire department. They had been protecting him for years. allowing him to act with impunity. And Michael was determined to make them pay for it. Meanwhile, Officer McAllister was holed up in his small apartment, unable to escape the storm he had created. The media had turned on him, and even his fellow officers had started to distance themselves. The same people who once had his back were now silent, and McAllister knew it was only a matter of time before his past caught up with him. His lawyer had advised him to keep a low profile, but the fear was consuming him. His once ironclad confidence had shattered, replaced by the crushing realization that his career, and possibly his freedom, was on the line. His phone rang incessantly, but he didn't answer. The weight of the situation was too much. He hadn't meant for things to escalate the way they had. Sure, he'd been angry. He always got angry when people challenged his authority. But he never meant to put Samuel Hayes in a coma. Now, the consequences of his actions were becoming clearer. The whole town was watching. The entire state was watching. And Michael Hayes, the state attorney general, was leading the charge against him. Back in Hanover, the protests were growing by the day. Signs calling for justice for Samuel Hayes, calling for McAllister's arrest, were everywhere. People marched through the streets, chanting for reform, for accountability. Michael, despite the emotional toll, had kept his focus sharp. Every public appearance, every speech, was a step closer to the justice his father deserved, and the systemic change the community desperately needed. The pressure was mounting on the local police department. Complaints against McAllister had been buried for years, ignored by the higher-ups who were all too willing to protect their own. But now, the truth was coming to light. Michael's investigation had uncovered damning evidence, internal memos, complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and misconduct that had been quietly swept under the rug. The very department that was supposed to protect the community had allowed McAllister to continue his violent behavior without consequence. Michael knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let this slip through the cracks. The public was demanding swift justice, and he had to deliver. The breakthrough came when Michael's team uncovered something truly shocking. It wasn't just McAllister who was responsible for the violence. The entire police department had a history of shielding officers like him, letting them continue their abuses without so much as a slap on the wrist. The town's police chief, Tom Wilson, had been covering up the complaints for years. And now, the public was learning about the extent of the corruption. Michael wasn't just after McAllister anymore, he was after the whole system. He spent countless hours drafting legal motions, pushing for the release of internal records, and preparing his case. His father's condition remained unchanged, still in a coma, but Michael wasn't going to stop. For Samuel, for Hanover, for the countless others who had been victims of police brutality and systemic failure. The day of the indictment came, and with it, the inevitable clash between the system that had protected McAllister and the relentless pursuit of justice led by Michael Hayes. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras flashing as the town's biggest case in years began. Officer McAllister sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, his hands trembling. His lawyer whispered in his ear, but McAllister could barely focus. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The video of Samuel's assault, the long list of complaints against him, the public outcry. The pressure was suffocating. As Michael entered the courtroom, his eyes briefly met those of McAllister. For a moment, the two men locked gazes. One a man who had devoted his life to justice, the other a man who had abused his power for far too long. The weight of the moment hung in the air. The judge called the court to order, and the charges were read aloud. McAllister's face remained blank as the prosecutor laid out the evidence, piece by piece. The video footage, the testimonies from witnesses, the history of complaints against him. The overwhelming truth of the case was clear. There was no escape. As the trial progressed, Michael's legal team worked tirelessly, and it became clear that the corruption within the police department went far beyond just McAllister. The investigation into Chief Wilson revealed years of cover-ups, suppression of evidence, and blatant disregard for the rights of Hanover's citizens. At the conclusion of the trial, McAllister was found guilty of assault, official misconduct, and violating Samuel Hayes' civil rights. The courtroom erupted in cheers. But Michael remained focused. The fight wasn't over. The public victory came quickly after the trial. Protests erupted again, but this time, the chants were not of anger. They were of hope. Justice had been served, but the battle for systemic reform was just beginning. Within weeks of McAllister's conviction, Chief Wilson was forced to resign. The investigation into the police department continued, and many of the officers who had protected McAllister were reassigned or put under investigation. But the true victory came when Samuel Hayes finally woke from his coma. It had been a long, difficult road, but his recovery symbolized the resilience of the community and of Michael. The fight for justice had taken everything from him, but it had also given him a new sense of purpose. Standing by his father's side in the hospital room, Michael whispered, "We did it, Dad. We got them. The fight isn't over, but we've made the first step. You taught me to never back down. I'll carry that with me every day." Samuel smiled weakly, his fingers twitching in response. He may not have been fully recovered, but the victory was theirs. And the fight for justice, true justice, was just beginning.